Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm Meryl Simon, the chair of the Shaker Heights chapter of the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. As most of you know, the League is a nonpartisan grassroots organization who works to protect and expand voting rights. We're also committed to voter education because the combination of the right to vote and the knowledge about issues is crucial for voters to feel engaged and empowered in our democracy. And that's why we're here tonight, to talk about how the changing nature of news and journalism impacts us all. Our moderator tonight is Lynn Lilly, a veteran League member who also serves on our board, works on forums, voter education, and communications. She brings decades of experience in communications, public relations, and marketing to our discussion tonight. Here's Lynn to introduce our panelists.
I think the trickiest part is getting up those stairs. Good evening. Thank you all for being here. Oh, and our third panelist is here. Yay. I'm going to start with a quote tonight. Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. Any guesses who that was? Thomas Jefferson. You knew that. And while we get our news from many, many more sources than newspapers now, his point remains. In a democracy, we need news and journalists. We're fortunate tonight to have experts to speak to about our questions and our concerns. I'll begin the session using questions developed within the League, and then we'll do audience questions after that. You should all have been offered an index card and a pencil if you needed one to write your questions down. There are people roaming the hall. Just hold it up and somebody will pick it up and bring it up. Please remember this is a place for learning, not finger pointing or inflammatory language. And just so we can get through as many questions as possible, if there are similar topics, we may do some combining and editing. So, with the housekeeping out of the way, let's meet our panelists. First is Lila Mills, Editor-in-Chief at Signal Cleveland, the inaugural newsroom in the Signal Ohio network of independent, community-led nonprofit newsrooms. Mike McIntyre is Executive Editor at Ideastream Public Media, which includes WKSU, WCLV Radio, and WVIZ-TV. And Subodh Chandra, attorney, is founder and managing partner of the Chandra law firm. His and his firm's cases frequently involve First Amendment issues. So welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Good evening.
For our first question, we're going to start at the macro level. The title of the forum, Challenge Newsrooms, sets the stage. Political polarization, shrinking resources, fragmented audiences, First Amendment issues. It seems like the news is in the news almost daily. Of all of those things, what is the major challenge in your mind? What keeps you up at night? We'll start with you, Lila.
I mean, it is a daily balance in which we're very young. So Signal Cleveland, which is about a 15 to 20 person newsroom, we launched at the end of 2022. So what keeps me up at night is this balancing act between the resources we need to sustain ourselves and the news we aim to do. So the ambition that we have, the resources we currently have, and the resources we're going to need to keep going. I think in the current climate, we try to do a really, really good job of defining what makes us unique, what is the additive sauce that we bring to the ecosystem, and we try to do that. If we can do what makes us unique, what no one else can do, then that brings us value in the ecosystem. There are going to be things that Ideastream can do that we can't do, and we want to make sure that we're not just piling onto the same bandwagon. We want to define what we bring to the table and do that well.
Mike?
Isn't she smart? What she said. No.
We've known each other 25 years.
Yeah, it's been a while. We used to work together at the Plain Dealer, most media, in this town used to work together at the Plain Dealer at some point.
Very true.
And that's including the great Richard Peary, who's here,
Yes.
who's one of the greatest journalists that ever lived in Cleveland. Actually, let's have a round of applause for Richard Peary. One of the things that keeps me up at night is the fact that when Richard and I and Lila were at the Plain Dealer, at the height of its size of its newsroom, it was somewhere around 400, 450 journalists. That included photographers, editors, reporters. And when you look now, the numbers are lower. I'm very proud of the work that we're doing, and I can tell you in a bit too that we're actually pretty healthy right now. I'm proud of the fact that Signal was stood up in 2022, and when these new places are stood up, you always hear you're gonna make it a year or two, and then the funding is gonna run out. They have found a way to sustain and will continue to, and in fact are growing. And there are other examples of that across the country, the Texas Tribune, all kinds of other places that are just doing really good work. So I'm encouraged by that, but it also keeps me up at night that we don't have the numbers that we used to have in journalism, and how are we gonna serve the communities that we need to serve? This is not just a job where, you're trying to make a product and sell it. It's a mission, and it's a responsibility that we have for our community. Local communities need local news in order to thrive. So what keeps me up is how we're gonna continue to do that. And then secondly, it's the audience. You guys are all consumers of media, or you wouldn't be here. Also, I can tell by your age. I'm looking at everyone, and most are younger than me, but you're, and I just turned 60, so I'm up there now. But it's, when I look at my kids who are 27 and 24, I see two young, smart people who grew up with two journalist parents. My wife was the editor of Cranes for a long time and had been at the Plain Dealer with us, of course. And they don't consume news. They hear it from us. They know about things because it might come across their social media transom. And we're all talking about how we're going to deliver news via social media. But they're not looking for news on social media. They're looking for some crazy video or some other thing. Somehow the news gets to them. My kids are smart. They're informed. They vote, which is important. But my worry is, how are we going to keep these people in the loop? And what is it we're going to do? And it can't be that we're all going to do our news as like a TikTok reel. That isn't going to happen. We will move in. We do Instagram. We do other things to meet them. But my worry is, if they don't want news, and the Pew Research survey showed that in general, and this is last year in 2024, in general, news consumption on all age groups is going down, but particularly among young people. How do we change that? You'll ask me that question. You're probably going to want an answer tonight. I've got no answers. None. That keeps me up at night.
Subodh, could you give the legal point of view on what keeps you up at night?
What doesn't keep me up at night? I do, before I answer that though, I do want to riff a little bit on what Mike was just saying, because I have triplet 21-year-olds, and I agree with Mike's observation. They're somewhat informed about what's going on in the world, but they're not consuming it through the news media outlets that, for the most part, the ones that I consume, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Cleveland.com, Signal, NPR, Ideastream, everything I can get my hands on in terms of the quality local stuff and the quality national stuff. What was very interesting recently on a trip, my wife and I wanted to take a special trip with our niece before she started college. She's a college freshman. And we went to Michigan, and what was really interesting was every morning she would go to YouTube and she would watch the top segments from Colbert, from The Daily Show, I think it was Jimmy Kimmel. Like, she would watch this stuff, and she was getting her news about what had happened that way. So that was just mind-blowing to see. Now, in terms of what's keeping me up at night, I could literally keep you here all night with that right now. And Mark Twain famously said that rumors of his death were greatly exaggerated. I do believe that we are at a moment where rumors of the impending death of the rule of law and democracy are not greatly exaggerated. In my lifetime, I spent a lifetime trying to run away from those big law firms. I did spend some time in some big law firms, but I didn't want to be a part of that. I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer, public interest lawyer, government lawyer, prosecutor. And, but I never, in my worst nightmares, I would have never thought that the biggest, allegedly baddest institutions in the practice of law, places like Paul Weiss, places like Skadden, storied places in the big law community would bend the knee to a despot. I never could have, especially right after watching Perkins Coie stand up and go get an injunction immediately from a federal court. I mean, these legal issues are not particularly complicated in terms of well-established constitutional law, that this is First Amendment retaliation. The executive orders literally spell out the First Amendment retaliation. I'm going after you because you represented people against me. I mean, it's there in black and white, and that's why the injunction was obtained so quickly. So to watch those institutions, to watch Columbia and other institutions that I just venerate collapse, it is so deeply distressing to me that I am very worried that, and then when I saw what happened to the Associated Press, which I know we're going to talk about later, I am greatly concerned that our strongest institutions lack the fortitude and resilience to fight for fundamental truths and American values. And when you look at the First Amendment, we often think of the First Amendment as just free speech, right? But it's not. It's so much more than that. Free speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of association, right? So for lawyers to associate with certain clients and causes. There's so much more than speech there. And to see those fundamental issues of First Amendment rights, due process rights, like watching somebody be kidnapped off the street and shipped off to an El Salvadoran prison, and see judges not able to just ensure that the law is followed, those things are keeping me up at night. They are going to continue to keep me up at night. And I keep saying to myself, my God, it's only been a couple of months. I mean, if I'm this sleepless, what is going to happen? So I'm sorry to begin our program on such a somber note, but you asked the question, what's keeping me up at night? And I'm telling you, that's what's keeping me up at night, and I think it needs to keep all of us up at night. And this is going to require a level of activism and vigilance that is just far beyond, I think, anything this country has seen before.
Thank you. I think you're right. I think a lot of people are here because all of the things you're talking about are keeping us up at night. Which comes to the next question. A recent op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal said holding powerful people accountable by reporting things they don't want reported was always the most important role news played. The exposure of malfeasance, ineptitude, corruption, or just plain stupidity keeps a country honest and working well. Lila and Mike, do you agree? And Subodh, do you think that that's legally dangerous? Is your job to speak truth to power?
I wish our job was just one thing. If that was it, then certainly that's a prime candidate. I think journalists need to be watchdogs. I don't think every shop can do that all the time. It would be great in this town if we had a dedicated investigative unit, like just all they do is investigation. Marshall Project, another nonprofit, does a lot of that in the court system. But I think our job is broader than that. It is to hold people to account, but it's also to inform communities. Communities need to know what's going on. It's one of the central missions, I'm sure Lila will talk about, of Signal, is being into communities to give basic information to people about how to vote and how to pay a utility bill and what's going on with their representatives. And you can't be there, and so we are. So I think the job is a little broader. I understand the sentiment about afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted, but I also think that's a bit broader than an individual newsroom can focus on. On the other hand, we will look specifically at stories that hold governments, private companies, people in general to account. And we do that by being involved in the community to the point where we know what's going on. We have beat reporters that are there, and can do enterprise. And I've called it this year in our newsroom the Year of Enterprise, which means I want to see more stories that no one would know but for us than stories that come from press conferences and handouts and other types of things. We still have to cover those. They're important. You want to know that the Browns made this announcement or that. But we also then want to dig behind that and get things that you wouldn't know without our reporters.
I think for us, and I would bet the same for Ideastream, it's very locally based. And I do think that people in Cleveland do want us to hold local officials accountable. But they also need to Mike's point, the basic information. So I think a lot of times, particularly as the resources have been shrinking over the last few decades, we don't have the resources of hundreds of reporters to spread out across the city. And so sometimes when we're producing and publishing news, it's going over the heads of the majority of people we're trying to reach. They need the basic news and information. One of the biggest questions we've gotten, we get a lot of questions around elections. Some biggest questions, what am I going to see on my ballot? What does this ballot language mean? So really, really pulling back to the super basic information. What is it? What are you going to see when you walk in that voting booth? What does it mean? Then I think you have another layer of folks who maybe are already consuming news who do want to know more about what's happening with my local officials. We have one of our reporters is a community reporter. He's tasked with going out into one neighborhood in our first year and just making himself seen at many community events as possible. And after he did that for several months, people started saying to him, well, this is nice. I like seeing you. I like hearing you write. I like reading what you're writing about this event or that. But we actually want you to start telling us what these folks, like our city council person and other folks at local nonprofits, should be doing. They were asking him to begin to do the accountability work. So I think people are hungry for that, but I also think people are really hungry to just basic information. Help me understand these things that I'm running up against in my daily life.
And I have to agree with that. When we put out voter guides, they're among the most read on our website. We opened a portal which was, we'll answer your questions. We worked with something called America Amplified, which is a project out of Indianapolis, WFYI, and a number of NPR stations got together, got some grant funding, and we went and asked people, what do you need to know, and how can we answer that for you? And one of the things was not just who's on my ballot, but what do I have to take to the polls to vote? Like, things have changed. Do I need a driver's license? I can't bring just a bill anymore. I need 2 of these things. People get really frustrated when they finally, and you guys know this, the League of Women Voters' mission is to enable voting. When people finally get to the point where they'll say, I'll go and stand in a line and vote, and then are told they can't, that's frustrating. And we're hearing that from people. So when we do a guide, it's always, here's what you got to do in order to vote. Here's when you have to register. Here's where you have to arrive. Make sure you check on your polling place, because they've changed, particularly in Cleveland, when they narrowed down the number of council seats.
Subodh?
So I think I just want to expand on the previous comments, but from a different perspective. So I don't think there's anybody second to me in or who surpasses me in the respect I have for our journalistic institutions in Cleveland and their resiliency over what's happened in the marketplace. And it's just, and yet at the same time, it's been incredibly painful for me, for somebody who is not just a news consumer, but often represents newsmakers, whistleblowers, people who have information on malfeasance or misfeasance occurring in suburban governments or in major institutions. Nothing has been more heartbreaking in seeing, and I think Mike was alluding to this in his opening remarks, the numbers, the diminishing numbers and the capacity of our local media. That's why Signal's emergence is just so fantastic and exciting as an alternative. But what I have been experiencing in the last 20 years, let's say 20 years ago, if I became aware of some malfeasance or misfeasance because somebody reported it to me, but it was not something that was legally actionable or that we were going to necessarily take legal action on, there used to be, I used to have on speed dial, there were people I could call and I could say, hey, look, I got this juicy tip for you, right?
I always appreciated that.
I know you did, Mike. But we could lay it out, and what used to happen if, and the Plain Dealer, now Cleveland.com, is the paper of record. You know, it was often a place you'd want to go with that. And you may recall in years past on Sundays, if there was a major investigation, I'm thinking back to the big expose on the probate court and favoritism between judges and lawyers was one of the major investigations. I think Mark Gillespie or somebody did that. And it would be, you know, front page above the fold, 2 full pages inside, and it would be a big expose with some side articles. It would be pretty incredible. And then sometimes then local TV media and others would then pick it up and run their own angles on that. We see less and less capacity for that now because of the need for clicks and quick stories and more content and put it out there. And I'm not, trust me, I'm not faulting anybody in local media for this. I think it's just the nature of the economics and what's changed. With that diminished capacity, it does mean that there have been stories. I mean, I have to confess I sort of started to give up a little bit because I recognize that things that I could have just let people know about 20 years ago that would have been picked up and run with, I started to realize over time they're not going to be viewed as either as newsworthy. Oh, okay, it's just suburban corruption in some suburb of Cleveland. Well, you know, maybe not. Something we're going to investigate. We're certainly not going to devote the resources to it the way we used to. And I think that diminished capacity has 2 consequences. One is we just don't know about all the skeezy stuff going on in our community, which is really bad for us as citizens. But there's another consequence that I have been seeing. I'm personally seeing this in my law practice, which is an emboldening of people with power. An emboldening of people in government institutions who have their own petty fiefdoms, an emboldening of, you know, city council people who might be corrupt in this community or that community, and because there are fewer watchdogs, there's just less capacity to catch and expose that stuff, and when there's no fear of being caught or exposed, then that's just going to embolden the bad behavior. I don't have an answer for it, unfortunately, other than to hope and pray that institutions like Ideastream and Signal just continue to deepen and thrive and expand their capacity, that somehow happens, because it is a gap in coverage that is occurring in our community.
Now let's flip to the other side of the coin. A continuation of that last quote was, nations with a thriving and trusted media are more open, freer, and more efficient and more prosperous. I want to talk about how your organizations earn trust. I'm going to start with Mike and finish with Lila.
Okay.
So
That's
walk
because
us
she
through-
knows
walk us-
my organization simply cannot foster trust.
Walk us through a healthy newsroom. That's how do you hold your people to the highest standards, fact-checking and lack of bias?
So what is a healthy newsroom? That's kind of part of how do we get at trust. So I think a healthy newsroom is one that has a good culture, a culture of mission. What we're trying to do is to inform the community. I think people that come in, and when we hire them, we make sure that we discuss this, but this is how a journalist acts. We have our code of ethics that's transparent and put on our website. We have editors that read everything that's then spoken on the radio or put on our website, and we apply, you know, the basic tools of journalism to those things. Yes, people are going to have their own personal biases. And yes, part of our job is to call out absolute BS. And so if we call out BS and it happens to be somebody of a particular party or somebody that's very, very popular, then the assumption is that you're anti that party, that person, or that policy. And it's not the case. The case is there's an issue here where what's been spoken is not true, or where I'm going to get response from somebody that might challenge that, which is what we should be doing in a democracy, which is having discussions on all sides of those things. So at our place, we try to be sure that you check your own personal bias and you're not just saying, I don't like that, and so I'm going to say this, but I am going to examine those issues and I'm going to speak to experts and talk about that. I think you mentioned trust, and I think that's actually in our mission statement, is to earn the trust of the community. And I will say that I'm proud of the fact that I think we're doing that. We had a recent fund drive. By the way, does anyone want a tote bag or anything? If you do, I got a deal for you. Ideastream.org/donate. But at our latest fund drive, we didn't we met our goal. Our goal was not incredibly ambitious. It's very uncertain financial times at the moment. We had a record number of members. And for us, if you are a member of Ideastream, you trust what Ideastream is doing. You wouldn't be giving us money for a free service. And we had a record number in this last pledge drive. So it makes me understand that people are getting that proposition value and giving us trust. And then there's been a couple of studies. I mentioned the Pew one a while back, last January in 24. There was another study that was just done last month that's going to be in the American Journal of Political Science, conducted by professors from Rice, Syracuse, Duke, and Louisiana State. And what they found is, despite eroding consensus about credible political news sources, much of the public still trusts local media. So when you hear people talk about, I don't trust the media, and they're talking about CNN, MSNBC, Fox, all of those things nationally that they, now 60 Minutes, all of those things nationally that they, through their echo chamber, are hearing something or seeing something that doesn't quite comport with what they talk to all their friends about and believe. In local news, as Lila alluded to, we're concerned about what's happening on the ground here, and we'd like to be more concerned about suburban corruption, believe me. But we are covering those issues, and people are seeing it. They know we're local. They know we're real people. We're trusted. You can call me anytime at Ideastream, and that builds trust. And really, that's the whole thing. If you don't have trust, we're not going to get support. We have a different funding model. Signal does now, too, as a nonprofit. I'm not worried about clicks, ever. I want people to react to our stories. And by the way, they react to enterprise stories much better than they do process stories. So when we do something you're not going to get somewhere else, we're going to get more clicks. And yeah, that's good. That means we're connecting with our audience. But I'm not there to rate the tacos that you can get at the drive-thrus in Cleveland and see how many people want to click on that because they like tacos. That's not what we do. And we're building trust through the work that we're doing. That's how we're going to sustain into the future.
Lila, you told me a story the other day about how one of the ways you build trust about your first job. And you went to a house.
Oh, I was saying, so let me back up a little bit. We are trying to do two things. One, we do, because we are new and because we started with zero reputation in Cleveland, we are trying to spread the word. So we do want more and more people to know we exist and to share the information about who we are. From a trusting perspective, I think I think in general people do not trust media. I think we have an additional level of, when we started, people would say, "Who are you?" So before they could even talk to us, they had to begin to understand who we are. And then you build that kind of reputational trust that Mike is talking about. So I think we've done a good job of that over the last few years. I think we have a long way to go for more folks to know we're here and what we do and what makes us unique. I was telling the other day, I was saying when I was a young reporter, a crime reporter, often going on people's porches, knocking on their doors when they had either had a family member who was a victim of crime, or I was talking to them about a loved one who had been arrested or charged with a crime, they would often say to me, "Well, why do you work for that paper? Why do you work for that paper? Like, that paper isn't for us." And I thought it was always interesting. At the time, as a young reporter, I never thought about it. I just kind of had this spiel I would give. Well, between my byline and my phone number and email at the end, everything that I write is going to be an accurate representation of what we talk about today, but I can't tell you what the headline's going to be. I can't tell you what the photo's going to be. I can't tell you, your child's mugshot is not going to be in the paper. But over time, what I realized is that they really didn't trust this media organization. They didn't trust the entity, and that wasn't because of something that we'd done the week before. That was really probably more generational. So one of the challenges, I think, for an organization like Signal is, yes, we want folks who are already connected to media, who are already engaged with Ideastream or other media in town, to know we're here too, and to find us additive. But we also want to reach folks who have disengaged from media probably decades ago, and figure out how to bring them back in and how to get them to trust what we're giving. And also, how do we learn what they actually need? What will they actually engage with? Is it TikTok? Is it Instagram? Is it flyers? Sometimes we create flyers and we'll go out to events and actually just hand people a flyer of information. So I do think trust is a huge thing we're trying to earn. And the last thing I would say is one of the hallmarks of what makes us different is we have this Documenters program. And this is across the country. There are, I think, 25 or 27 Documenter sites across the country. We host one in Cleveland. We have another in Akron, our Akron Newsroom, and in Cincinnati. And we train and we pay folks to go to public meetings and take notes. That, to me, is about us building trust. We've got 1,000 people who've signed up to do it across the county, at least one person in every zip in the city and almost every zip in the county. Again, that shows me that people are hungry for this information. And when we started doing it, the core of us who started the work thought, well, maybe this is kind of a nerdy thing that we're into. But what we found is that people, all different types of people, our oldest documenter was 87. Our youngest has been teenagers. And so all different types of people find joy in going to public meetings and taking notes about them, and it almost doesn't matter what the content of the meeting is. It's the action of getting the information. So I also think there's something about building trust with media that has to also do with teaching kind of these journalistic skills to other folks. And we're not asking, this isn't really citizen journalism. We're not asking them to write stories. We're not asking them to question officials. We're just asking them, it's somewhere between a meeting minute and kind of, what you might tell your mom. These are edited and copy edited, so we are verifying this information. But I think there's something there in which if we can kind of build those skills, it's media literacy, it's about understanding the information and understanding the difference between misinformation and opinion and fact, that can go a long way towards also building trust, because then it doesn't just have to be the folks who are working within the newsroom at Signal, but it can be, hundreds of folks across the county who are in some way touched as part of this work.
Well, real quickly, I want to jump in on that too. We don't have documenters, but there's something that we were inspired to do with our engaged journalism team, which goes out, we'll have listening sessions, not write stories based on that. We just want to hear what you have to say. I think that builds trust. We get into a community and continue. Justin Glanville was embedded in one of the housing developments in Cleveland for more than a year before we started doing reporting on that. But we also have a program where we go and help people tell their own stories. We'll get to a group. There was a senior community in Parma, and we started talking to the seniors, and each one had a different kind of story to tell. One was about what he collected, and the other one was about that he was a dancer or something. And we helped them to get their thoughts together and create a 4-minute NPR-style feature, which they can then have forever. We had students at Richmond Heights High School. We had kids from the LGBTQ Center, and each one had a different type of story to tell. But by going in and sharing what you just said, which was giving them some of those skills and seeing how it's done and then putting their product on the air, we help build trust, not just among them, but among anyone that listened to it.
And I think, 25 years ago, when we were one of 400s of reporters at the Plain Dealer, we maybe wouldn't have needed to do that as much. But I think we, and probably others in the media industry, are forming partnerships and doing things differently than we would have done decades ago. I'm thinking of the work you've done with Peacemakers.
Right.
And we're going to do a partnership with a community organization around elections and engagement. So sometimes you build trust by partnering with a trusted outside organization that isn't a media organization and working together to do something in the community.
Thanks. Okay, we're eating into the audience questions time, but before we do that, Subodh, I would like to talk to you about First Amendment, freedom of information, sunshine laws. And if you'd like, you can start with the Sullivan versus New York case, where the Supreme Court announced standards for defamation and its implications to people like these, but also, if you want to pivot after that to the federal judge and the AP, I'll let you tell the story, I won't tell it.
Okay, so
Pick one and start, I guess.
Can you?
Yeah, we were
which part of
talking
it?
in class. Sorry.
Yeah, we were
Okay.
talking in class. Just repeat that last.
Oh,
part.
sure. We want to talk about freedom of information, sunshine laws, First Amendment. So the Sullivan versus New York.
Oh, sure. Okay.
And then also the Associated Press case where they were shut out of the.
Okay, so let me start off by saying that one of the great protections that media in particular, but also all of us have, in the interpretation of the First Amendment right of free speech came about in a famous U.S. Supreme Court case called New York Times v. Sullivan. And what the court did was establish a higher standard under which you can bring a defamation claim if you are a public figure, right? Now, you can have an argument about who's a public figure and who's not a public figure, but there's no doubt that the president is a public figure. Office holders are public figures. And then there are arguments of the law about others, like line police officers, but by and large, criticizing a government official public figure. And what the court did was establish a higher standard for, say, for ordinary defamation claims. You allege somebody slandered you, somebody libeled you, somebody made a false statement about you that injured your reputation. Opinion has always been protected, but somebody made a false statement about you. That's your allegation. That if you're a public figure, you have a much higher burden that you have to meet if you want to bring that case. And what that higher burden is that you have to prove what the law calls actual malice. Now, what does actual malice mean? It doesn't mean you were mean, okay? It has a narrow legal definition. And what that means is you either had knowledge, actual knowledge of the falsity of what you were saying, or you acted with something more than mere negligence, reckless disregard for the truth. So the answer was rather obvious and in front of you, but you acted with reckless disregard for the truth. Why is this Supreme Court so important, and why are we talking about it? Well, Donald Trump has said that he wants to do away with that standard, and he wants the U.S. Supreme Court to revisit that standard, which is well established in the law. And what that Supreme Court ruling did was give more comfort to journalism organizations for taking more risks in their coverage. Sometimes they get something wrong, but they're trying to dutifully report something and they report it. What it does is put them at less legal liability risk if they get something wrong or somebody claims that it's wrong, because that public figure who is being exposed or criticized has to meet that higher burden. So Trump has said that he wants to go after New York Times v. Sullivan, and that represents a potentially very serious threat to the First Amendment. And given the current composition of the U.S. Supreme Court, you can't rule out, given that Roe v. Wade was well-established law, reaffirmed in Planned Parenthood v. Casey, Whole Women's Health. I mean, it was very well-established law. Constitutional law thrown out the window. So we cannot be sure that if the right case doesn't go to the U.S. Supreme Court, or the wrong case, from my perspective, that we won't see a change in that standard, which will then radically change the freedom that media organizations feel, their risk proposition. They can be wiped out, with a litigation costs and a verdict. And it changes the risk calculation for the rest of us as well. Of the freedom that we feel as Americans to speak the truth as we see it about public figures. So it would fundamentally alter the calculation in America. It would bring us more in alignment to the defamation standards in the UK. So some might argue it's not the end of the world, but I think you do see a little less freedom, press freedom in the UK sometimes. So that's the first issue. The second issue I was asked about was the Associated Press case, and it's of great concern to me because, and interestingly, I handled some cases similar to this as law director of the city of Cleveland, where a TV station sued the mayor, alleging that they had been, quote unquote, locked out of City Hall. That wasn't true. And were being excluded from interviews, which was true. The mayor had decided to not grant interviews to a particular station because she thought their coverage was unfair. But that is her constitutional right about who she wants to associate and talk with, and so that station lost. Where the station would have won, and this is what the issue is with the AP, is if the mayor had said, I'm going to have a press conference in which all the media organizations are allowed to come to the mayor's conference room and hear the press conference, but I'm going to exclude this station in retaliation for their critical coverage of me. That would be First Amendment retaliation. And that's what happened with Donald Trump and the Associated Press. The president essentially, again, explicitly, every statement is a confession, from a legal standpoint. And he just admits the illicit motives that, and the statements were made as to why they were excluding the Associated Press was all about the content of coverage and all about the content of anticipated coverage. So it's not only First Amendment retaliation, but it's a prior restraint on speech. It's meant to have a chilling effect on speech. And the Associated Press effectively won. They did win their injunction that said they should be brought back to the table for these broader events. Again, no special entitlement to one-on-one interviews, but hey, if you're going to have a press gaggle, they need to be there. They have I think Mike might know better, or Lila might know better. I mean, I think it's well over 100-year history. It goes back to the late 19th century, in which the Associated Press has always been included in these events at the White House. So this was unprecedented. And last I checked, which was, I'm constantly doom scrolling, and I haven't had a chance to doom scroll since last night, so I'm like fidgety right now because I was in a deposition all day, so I'm like freaking out because God knows what calamitous things happened today that I need to know about. But my understanding as recently as yesterday is that the White House is not complying with the federal injunction. Does anybody know if that's changed since last night?
I don't think it has.
Yeah. So I'm correct. Thank you. Even the blind squirrel finds a nut every now and then, right? So here I am saying to myself, this echoes back to my opening remarks, which is, this is the death of the rule of law. If the president can just not comply with a federal court order, this is really quite extraordinary. It's an extraordinary moment. It is a constitutional crisis by definition if the executive branch won't comply with the orders of the judicial branch. So that's where we are. And I do believe that between this sort of selection of who's going to be allowed in for press coverage, exclusion of others, exclusion of the Associated Press, what we're seeing is, it goes well beyond working the refs. I think what we are starting to see, and I'll leave it to the media folks to comment on whether they agree, but I believe what we're starting to see is an effect on the coverage. The friendliness of coverage by some outlets, because the refs have been worked so hard. Certainly that's true of the Washington Post and its editorials. You've seen departures of giants from that coverage. You saw Paul Krugman of the New York Times. An expert on trade, if we ever needed one, as a political columnist, and he's thrown in the towel at the New York Times. So we are beginning to see a cancerous effect of this kind of First Amendment retaliatory and prior restraint action on the nature of and scope and breadth and depth of coverage. And that, what does that mean? I'll wrap up with this. What scares me the most, it's bad enough to be scared about the rule of law and democracy, which is where I'm at, right? But to think that our public will thereby, from all of this, face a distortion of reality as it actually exists, and that you'll then have a less informed electorate making decisions about our future governance. That is just one of the most frightening outcomes of all.
I want to circle back to our journalists and then back to you, Subodh. We have a question from the audience. Why didn't the press stand more with AP? And I know some of them did, but why didn't they all? And then the second is the same question that Subodh asked. Are you starting to feel the chill of, what you can say, what you can't say? Are the DEI people coming after you? How is it going to affect your funding? How's it going to affect, is KSU going to lose,
So we'll start with that last part about funding. So you've seen that the president says he's working up an executive order to claw back money from NPR and PBS. Really, that's money that comes through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is set up as a private, separate entity. It's been funded through 2027. That funding has already been distributed. So it would be interesting to see that be clawed back. But still, the idea that there shouldn't be funding, you saw the forum that was held, the hearing that was held on that. We believe that we're going to be in fine shape. We think that every year when there's been an administration, basically it's been when there have been Republican administrations, there has been an effort in the House to defund NPR and PBS and a vote to do so. And every year the Senate has, every year that's happened, the Senate
Can
has
I interrupt you for a second, though?
Yes.
There was another quote someone gave us that related to DEI, that in a letter to Comcast, project author Brendan Carr said he had asked the FCC's Endorsement Bureau to open an investigation into the corporation, stating, "I'm concerned that Comcast and NBC Universal may be promoting invidious forms of DEI in a manner that does not comply with the FCC." I mean, well, you're not the FCC, but you have funders that are affected. Is it bigger than just the clawback, which...
Okay, well, I was just trying to get to that part
Sorry,
first.
didn't mean to
that
cut
was the
you
money
off.
part. So, long story short, we think that we're going to be fine. We're cautiously optimistic, and most of our funding, as I mentioned earlier, comes from members. And Subodh just showed me on his phone that he literally just donated $100. So I appreciate
Wait a second.
I've been a public radio freeloader for a bit too long.
But in regards to the DEI, listen, we're reporting on this not just at the federal level, but at the state level with Jerry Serino's bill that was signed by the governor and is now being put into effect. In terms of what we say, no, I'm not going to not talk about these issues. We are going to continue to pursue policies in our newsroom and in our building that make sense. Inclusivity is not a negative thing. We want to be inclusive of all of our audience. We want to be inclusive of all of our employees. And so I haven't changed anything with regard to that, and have not been told to change anything with regard to that. However, you are seeing some very credible institutions, and Subodh has referred to them, that are making changes. You're seeing organizations that are getting rid of DEI offices, calling them something else or doing something different with it. But for us, I have not seen that on a local level.
I'm not sure exactly how the relationship is with Kent State for you.
I'll tell you the relationship. Kent State is the license holder of WKSU. So we merged 2 years ago, WCPN and WKSU. Essentially, we took over operations of WKSU. The license is held by the university. We solely operate. It's our risk, it's our money. The university is basically out of it. So they own, though, the license, the operating license.
Could the FCC go after them?
I suppose. I mean,
can do
could
anything
the
they want.
FCC go after anybody that holds a license? And we've been
Gotcha.
hearing about this, not just for public media, but for media in general.
Right.
CBS being another good example.
Yes.
I would say one of the challenges of being a journalist, covering what's happening on the federal level, is determining when you have enough to go with without chasing everything that's happening, because it changes so quickly. So for us, we have limited resources, everybody does. If you would have told me 2 years ago that we would be explaining some of the things we've done this year around what's happening on the federal level and what does it mean for you locally, I would have said that's completely outside the scope of what we're going to do. We are relentlessly local. We are funded locally. So the funders in Cleveland are local philanthropy in Cleveland, and then local donors, regular everyday people that are donating to us. And we shift and change based on what we think folks are asking us to do. So we started last year a State House Bureau. So we have a reporter in Columbus, and we'll add another shortly. And we've done some reporting this year, trying to keep it focused on things like the VA and, federal workers who are in Cleveland, and trying to carve out what are the issues where we think they're most impacting folks locally, and what can we do to explain that for people. So we're very young in the nonprofit news ecosystem, which has been a growing ecosystem over the past 10 to 20 years. We're considered huge, right? We're very ambitious. We're one of the larger ones. But in the scope of when we were at the Plain Dealer and there were hundreds of reporters, we're very small. So you could drop 10 signals on Cleveland and not be where we were 20 years ago in terms of coverage of the city. So our funding is not impacted in the way that it might be if we were older or we had a more complicated funding model. But I think we also are not impacted by things like DEI. We're not big enough yet to have folks kind of influencing what we're covering as we might be if we were a larger, more national media organization, but I think it speaks to the fact that you do need lots of different media in play, whether it's community media or nonprofit media or public media, corporate media, because there are all these challenges. It's just a really challenging time, really challenging to figure out how to cover it, and then really challenging in additional ways.
Another question is, we've heard a lot of complaining, I don't think it was all complaining, but about the manner in which young people are obtaining their news. Maybe the news industry needs to meet them where they are. Are there any reputable organizations, which I think includes you, making an effort to reach younger folks in a manner that they will respond to?
Yeah, I text young people all day long. No, we are obviously always searching for ways to get new audiences and to inform younger people. We have a very robust Instagram initiative where every day we're taking a story and making it, whether it's a reel or it's a number of slides or other things, and we're seeing great progress. We just had a story about a webmaster in the College of Arts and Sciences at Case Western Reserve University who refused in order to take down DEI pages on their website. She wasn't fired for it, but she was told to hand over the keys to the website so they could do it. And they explained the reason why they needed to do it, and they're worried about federal funding. That story we put on Instagram, and last I looked, I think it was 2,500 likes, which is a lot on Instagram for us. And it's one of the top performing stories we've had on the web in a long time too, and obviously people would have listened on the radio. So it's working to get new audiences in that regard, but we can't do everything, and if you're going to cover the news in the way we've talked about, being responsible and being at city council meetings and trying to tie in what it all means when the federal government makes cuts, you can't then also go and do it as an interpretive dance on TikTok. So we are just as flummoxed as anybody else. We can't be at all the places young people are. We kind of need them to come to the realization that they need to have news in their lives, and that's an education issue. And that's one we're trying to do. We have a whole education department separate from the journalism side that's run by a former middle school principal. One of the things that we produce through that, we do direct classroom work, but we also produce something called News Depth, which is a show that is played in schools. It's on our website. But I can see our web traffic go way up every time it drops. One of the episodes drop. I think it's on Thursdays. And young people watch that. It's news. I actually love it because it's really good basic news, but young people really love it because it doesn't pander to them, but it's at a level where they can understand it. Our hope there, and we get all kinds of letters, and we had kids tour the other day, and they couldn't wait to meet Gabe Kramer, who's the host of it. But what our hope is through those kinds of efforts, we do get young people more interested in what is news, how do I get news? I saw it on television in school. Is there another way? There's a website that's also about all this stuff, and eventually bring them to the fold.
I think it's fair to say that nobody really has an answer, right? Lots is changing in journalism. I think we have different hypotheses about what we think will work, and we're each trying to do that in different ways. I think we are also trying to reach not just young people, we're also trying to reach senior citizens who tell us, hey, I'm not on social media, I'm not digitally connected, I need it in a different way. Right. So there are lots of different audiences that we're trying to reach in different ways. I think it really, really requires us to be incredibly, incredibly nimble, and to, when we try something, be able to assess it as quickly as possible and determine if it's not working, let's pivot. We also are putting a big effort into Instagram this year. I know others, like the Marshall Project, which is another nonprofit organization in town, they do a ton of stuff on TikTok, which I find always, engaging and entertaining, and they push the envelope there, I think, a little bit. I was speaking recently to a group of young professionals, and I asked them after I did my spiel, I said, well, how do you get your news? And they said, well, it's on our phone. And I said, okay, well, how? Well, no, it's just there. And I said, well, what apps are you? Well, no, it came with the phone. So I think a lot of times people are consuming the information that's in front of them, and they don't have to go look for it. And so I think we have to be really creative in figuring out how do we get there. But we don't have the answer yet. But I think we have some ideas, and we're trying some things out.
Did you not say that you had hired a new graphic artist, or?
We hired a social media engagement specialist, particularly to focus on Instagram.
Okay, we're back to cancel culture, but of the presidential kind. Please comment on President Trump's repeated assertions that he will cancel CBS or other people's license and even broadcast and report news. And also comment on the way major news sources are capitulating to the defamation claims and what national media organizations should do to respond. And you have 30 seconds.
We both said how relentlessly local we are.
Right.
So I'm going to leave that up
That's
to the nationals. And I will say, I just want to make one thing clear. And we are affiliated with, I mean, we purchase programming from NPR. And I think NPR there are a couple of things that Catherine Marr herself said they needed to do better. They needed to cover stories better, and she basically said these were things that happened before my time. I think one of the things that wasn't said are all the things that were covered that were essential and were covered incredibly well. And media organizations might have missed a couple of stories, but they've got a lot to be proud of. What we are at Ideastream is an independent, locally funded, local news organization with local leadership and power. Our ethics guidelines, everything we do is based on our own board in Cleveland and our newsroom leadership. So it is not something where NPR dictates anything. It comes down to how we're going to cover it or what it might be. The criticisms of NPR are of NPR. What we have is a local organization. Our funding, 10% of our funding comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. If we lost that 10%, it would be literally decimating, if people know what the word decimate means. I actually said it right this time. But it would decimate us in that regard, but it's 10%. It's 40% of our funding comes from individuals. We have 15% from the state because we operate the Ohio channel, which is basically C-SPAN for Ohio. But it's not as though if you said federal funding would somehow be threatened, would Ideastream go away? The answer is no. We'd hope to get more support locally.
Gotcha. Subodh, could you address this more from a national level?
Yeah, I just want to correct Mike, though, that as of today, 40.001% of his funding comes from individuals.
Sorry for generalizing.
And I would like to challenge all of you to do the same. If America is going to remain America, and I think that's in serious doubt, if America is going to remain America, the core value that we have is due process. So with due process, some tin pot dictator cannot just suddenly say, I'm going to take away CBS's license, I'm going to do this or that. But under this unitary executive theory that Trump and his ilk are advancing, where somehow the executive, there are no real independent agencies like the FCC, operated by commissioners appointed by different presidents over time with a rotating cast. If that unitary executive theory is viable and is sustained by the U.S. Supreme Court, then yes, he can do whatever he wants. But there still is supposed to be due process in which CBS or any other entity gets the opportunity to challenge the legitimacy and the basis for a removal of licensure or for entities for funding. And I think that is getting missed in almost all the conversations about Trump's actions. Due process just suddenly disappeared. An example is the announcement that, we're going to remove $2.2 billion from Harvard because you're supposedly violating Title VI by having DEI, Title VI of the U.S. Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is the prohibition on race discrimination. I mean, it's truly an inmates are running the asylum type of argument. But, in the normal world, right, the agency that used to investigate those things before it was 50% of its personnel were wiped out, and including my wife, who was their senior for 27 years. In the normal process, what would happen is the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights would investigate any such allegation of impropriety by Harvard. There would be a true comprehensive investigation. There would be a report. There would be a negotiation. There would be notice to Harvard that this is what you're alleged to have violated. Now answer for it. And then they would have an opportunity to challenge that in court if the federal government were threatening removal of grants. So due process somehow is just starting to fade, and really it's going to be up to the courts to figure out whether they're going to live up to that. Congress's role as a watchdog, Congress's role as an appropriator is also disappearing, where DOJ can just say, we've just decided to wipe out a department, even though Congress appropriated funds for it. The people's representatives made that decision. And then finally, the issue for what's being talked about, this cancel culture, I talked about this earlier, is what's the motive for why he's going after CBS and others? It literally First Amendment retaliation. He's being very open about that. I don't like what your coverage was. I don't like what your coverage was of me. I don't like the fact that you edited a video on 60 Minutes of, Vice President Kamala Harris on her interview, which of course that's routinely done. A big nothing burger when finally the full video was aired. But he's explicitly stating First Amendment retaliatory reasons for it, and that's why I think if federal courts wind up being normal, and I hope that they will remain somewhat normal. The doubtful thing is the normalcy of the U.S. Supreme Court right now. But assuming federal courts remain normal, there's going to be a nonpartisan, bipartisan consensus across judges, and that's been true so far in most of the rulings that we've seen on some of the more extreme things the administration has done. Judges appointed by Bush, judges appointed by Trump, judges appointed by Reagan, judges appointed by Clinton, Obama, all of them are just like, no, you can't do this. No, there's got to be due process. No. So I don't know if I'm sounding a hopeful note, because I think so much is in doubt. Well, so much is in doubt about whether, even if there are appropriate judicial rulings protecting our basic constitutional rights, whether the administration will nevertheless ruthlessly use its power and say we don't care, which throws everything into disarray. But I am still holding on to that glimmer of hope that there is a brink, and that there will be enough of a national consensus and a hue and cry that we won't go over that brink any further than we have. I mean, that's the only thing I can hold on to. So I think that while I'm taking all of those threats very seriously, I don't think you can blow them off. I'm nevertheless hoping that between media coverage and people becoming aware, and you saw, millions of people protest in the last few weeks, that the resistance, if you will just increase and increase as red lines into our constitutional order are crossed.
I would really encourage people to support local media, not just because I'm here representing local media, but because when things feel nationally so out of control, what do you do about these things? You can always come back and support local media. And I don't know if you've heard Barack Obama talk about one of the ways he won in 2008 was going to local towns. And even though he didn't get the endorsements from the small local papers, which were often conservative, they humanized him. So there is real power in what's local, and I think sometimes when we get frustrated, we're looking for an action. What can we do? And I think that definitely, support what's local, support what's here. We've got a really great bunch of community media papers and organizations in Cleveland. We've got a lot of great media in Cleveland that's representing a lot of different types of different communities, and I'd urge people to just go out there and support as much as you can.
Thank you. Questions about advocacy. We've talked about, the legal troubles you can get into if you're not careful. And we know that the Washington Post has stopped endorsing people, things like that. So in the past, journalism has sometimes taken a role in advocacy, or opinion at least, taking a position on a legislative issue like school funding or proposing ideas for multi-county sales tax to fund development. Do you think that's still part of the work of journalism and endorsing candidates? Do you think that's still part of the work of journalism, or no?
No.
Yeah, we get asked about that a lot. Do you take opinion pieces? Do you endorse? We do not. We're a nonprofit. We cannot. But I also think that one of the other things we are is nonpartisan. And so our goal is to spread across the state. Eventually, we want to get into rural communities and do the same thing we've done in Cleveland and Akron in rural communities. And so in order to do that, we really do need to figure out in a rural community what's the information you need to have regardless of what your political affiliation is or who you're voting for. And so I would say we don't do it, and and we don't intend to do it.
And we are in rural communities now with something called the Ohio Newsroom, which we operate, and it covers those uncovered areas of the state. Same point. It doesn't matter what political affiliation or what our opinions are. I say this, I mean, I hosted a show for 10 years called The Sound of Ideas, where we got everybody with their points of view, Subodh included. No one needs to know what my point of view is. No one cares. And so what I want to do is be as informed as possible to ask questions, and I would be asking Subodh probing questions from the other side, or ideally have someone there who has an opposite opinion of his. Because when you get that kind of information out, people can make their own decisions. They can listen to that if they're not just listening to an echo chamber and say, okay, I've been more informed. So I don't think it's our role. I think maybe there's a role in media. I mean, listen to cable news. All it is opinion. Yeah. It's not news anymore. Fox News has admitted it's entertainment. MSNBC clearly comes with its point of view. So that's their lane. I think, in the local journalism ecosphere that we're in, I don't even know if that's a word, but ecosystem that we're in, that there isn't a role for that. And I think more and more newspapers are not endorsing, not necessarily for the reasons the Washington Post put forward, but in general, even locally, they just want to give you the information and not then be saddled with, we picked this person, and then get that kind of opprobrium from people.
Got it.
I will say I've tried to pull a Jedi mind trick on Mike a few times, get him to reveal his viewpoint, and he's not susceptible, unfortunately.
I want to tell you a true story. At dinner one time, when my kids were in high school, my daughter turned to me and she said, "What are you?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And she was at the time talking about some sort of political issue, and I kept saying, "Well, what else do you think about that, and why do you think that?" And she finally was like, "Do you have any opinions? Like, what are you?" So you're right.
Great. It's really good to know you're consistent at home. I guess I have mixed feelings about this. Like, as a lawyer and practicing litigator, I've sometimes read Cleveland.com's endorsement of judges, and I've been like, are you just out of your minds? Like, they'll endorse a judge, and I know exactly what happened. They'll kind of report in it. We had an interview, and in the interview, so-and-so came across as so experienced and so well-informed. And like everybody in the legal community knows they're an unmitigated disaster, right? Or they don't have the relevant experience, or they have a real temperament problem, but they're a good politician and they can put on a good show. So, for the value of endorsements, there have been times where I'm really questioning, sometimes the sanity, the thoroughness, and sometimes just the, is there an agenda? Is there some agenda by the poobahs of the institution, especially when you're talking about presidential endorsements, and then you'll sometimes news will come out that the editors wanted to endorse a certain way, but the owner said, hell no, that happened here in Cleveland, right? At the Plain Dealer, that was reported. So, but then there are times where there are these institutions that cover the news and the people on these editorial boards who are often very experienced, seasoned investigative reporters who really knew their chops, but then eventually moved into the editor and opinion side of things. I value their thinking and their judgment. Say there's an initiative on the ballot, and I don't have as much time to fully study it and think about the upside and downside, and they'll lay out in a thoughtful, lengthy op-ed why they're either for it or against it, and explain some things that I wouldn't have otherwise known. So I think there is a value at appropriate times. There has to be humility. There has to be an understanding that there are a couple of risks. One is you'll be overly influential. The other is that you will then be perceived as biased because you're going to make half the population very unhappy. So I think in a measured and judicious way, there is a role for opinion in these institutions, but it may vary by institution. And I can certainly understand why Signal Cleveland would say we're not going to go that route. So what scares me is when you have an institution that has a venerated tradition of that, like the Washington Post, and suddenly, the owner who you had hoped had saved the day with his money, from taking it from the Graham family, suddenly, announces, no, we're not, almost sort of makes a public announcement, we're not do any of this DEI social justice stuff now, we're just gonna do, freedom and free markets. Like, what are you talking about? You have Colbert King, and you have Eugene Robinson, and you have some of the most, Ruth Marcus, and some of those magnificent editorial writers. I mean, Ruth Marcus was there for, I think, like 40 years. And suddenly there's no place for them and role for them, and all the thoughtful opinion. I mean, their opinions that they would express in their op-eds were exceptionally well informed, right, and researched. So that's of great concern to me when we see when it is a tradition at an institution, when it suddenly disappears.
I do want to say one thing so I'm not accused of hypocrisy, and that is I don't think there's a role for opinion, like endorsement, political opinion, those kind of things. But we did just reach an agreement with our friend Steve Litt, formerly of the Plain Dealer, and he's working with us now as a freelance writer. And he will be doing analysis of economic development issues like the lakefront, like Brown Stadium, and he will be doing art reviews at the museums, et cetera. So that is opinion in some way, and it's new for us. But I think there's a level of cultural analysis that is lacking in the Cleveland media system, and that's why we've asked him to work with us.
Agreed. Well, thank you. This has been interesting and frustrating and wonderful and horrible and horrifying. And we need to keep talking like this, but not tonight. So please join me in thanking our panelists for tonight who shared their time and ideas. Lila, Mike, Subodh. I do want to mention to both of you that the League of Women Voters has something called Observers, and in Shaker Heights, about 8 or 9 meetings of the city and the library and school board are covered by us, doing what documenters do. And the League of Women Voters also has a voter guide online. So
We link to it.
there you go. This forum has been recorded and will be posted to the League's YouTube page and also to our social media by tomorrow, so tell your friends. And if you'd like to bring more forums like this to Shaker, we invite you to consider a tax-deductible donation to the Shaker League's Education Fund. And to do that, you can go to bit.ly, L-Y, bit.ly/donate Shaker LWV. That's bit.ly/donate Shaker LWV. And thank you all for being here, and good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.